Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Roxy and this is my YouTube channel where I plan on making videos about my journey with long COVID and being a late diagnosed autistic adult. In my previous video I spoke a bit about what happened when I had my first seizure-like activity after getting my first COVID infection in 2022. These were prolonged episodes of seizure-like activity which included quite severe dystonia. After those two initial seizure-like events, I continued to have many more seizure-like events over the next 2 months. I had my third seizure-like episode around 5 days after the second episode that I had. I told a staff member that I didn't feel very well. I had the same impending doom sort of feeling that happened beforehand in my previous seizure-like events, and I felt very, very unwell. I then proceeded to fall to the ground with a thud. At this point, I was only just experiencing seizures. I didn't know at the time that it was about to happen as quickly as it did. Now I'm much more used to having seizures, and so I'm much more aware of how much time I have before a seizure might occur. But at the time, I was new to having seizures, and so I didn't realise that it was about to happen there and then. I just fell to the ground with a thud and proceeded to violently start fitting once again, shaking head to toe. My muscles were stiff, my head was arched backwards, my neck was arched backwards, my fingers were like claws, and my arm was twisted backwards in the air behind me. Now that I know what dystonia is, I know that what I was experiencing during these seizure-like events was severe dystonia. I wasn't aware at the time that this was what it was. I just knew that my limbs were twisted in uncomfortable and unusual positions, and they would be stuck like that for many hours, but I didn't know what it was. But now that I have had so many episodes and have had so many symptoms, 4 years later almost, I'm very aware that what I was experiencing was dystonia during these seizure-like events. I remember clearly that it was a Saturday evening and the paramedics were called, and again they gave me oxygen, but the oxygen wasn't working for me, it wasn't stopping the seizure. They tried to check my pulse, but they couldn't check my pulse because the pulse reader they put on your finger to check your oxygen saturations, it kept flying off my finger because of how violently I was shaking, and so they couldn't get a pulse reading. They tried to take my pulse manually from my wrist, but they struggled to because of how much I was shaking. After almost an hour of me violently shaking and my muscles stiff and my limbs twisted, they decided to take me to A&E because of how severe the episode was presenting. I remember I was super grateful to the paramedic because despite being in a psychiatric hospital and despite previous paramedics in other occasions dismissing me, he actually took it very seriously, and I remember he scooped me up and quickly whisked me into the ambulance, and they ended up blue lighting me to the hospital because of the presentation and how long it was going on for. I have had many negative experiences with paramedics and or doctors in A&E or staff in A&E. However, I have had some really positive experiences also with a few paramedics here and there, which I'm very, very grateful for. It's one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about talking about my experiences of these seizure-like events, because I don't know how many other people out there are in psychiatric hospitals currently who may be experiencing something similar, but because they're in the psychiatric hospital, they may not be taken seriously, and paramedics or doctors in A&E may not know what dystonia is, and they may not be familiar with dystonia happening during someone's seizure. In my experience, in the first few years of getting sick from COVID with all of these severe neurological symptoms, I was heavily dismissed by both paramedics and A&E doctors. And I guess that's why I talk about what I have gone through, because I want to help raise awareness and educate and hopefully less people will be dismissed. I think I might have a seizure because my speech is changing. I just had lunch maybe half an hour ago. I did feel a little bit sick afterwards, that might have a seizure, but it hadn't happened yet until now that I'm talking. Talking is a huge trigger for my symptoms to surface. Talking and eating, I have noticed over the past few years that they both make me much more symptomatic quickly. I'm going to try to continue filming anyway. My speech is changing in tone and in pace and volume, and that is because this can happen to me before I have a seizure. Anyway, this is why I'm passionate about talking about what happened to me in my experiences and sharing that, because I imagine there are some people in psychiatric hospitals at the moment who may be very sick with seizures, and they may not be taken seriously by medics. Once I arrived in the hospital, there was a big team of staff waiting for me in majors in the A&E department. However, as soon as they realised that I was a patient coming from the psychiatric hospital, majority of the staff disappeared almost instantly, and they didn't take me seriously. And so all of the staff went away, bar one doctor and one either nurse or support worker. I don't know who they were. I was in the seizure event at the time. My eyes were open and I had some awareness, and therefore that's why I'm able to recall what happened. I also have kept a symptom diary, and so I had written it all down after the event, what had happened to me. And so now, almost 4 years later, I'm able to recall it because of the level of awareness that I had, as well as what I'd written down in my symptom diary. When I arrived in A&E, they got my jumpers off that I was wearing because I was soaking wet with sweat. My whole clothes were drenched in sweat because of how violently I was shaking and how long the seizure event had gone on for. So they tried to cool my body down by taking off some of the layers that I was wearing. They were admittedly entirely drenched in sweat anyway. And then they tried to get a pulse reading. They had to tape the pulse reader to my finger with tape so that it wouldn't fly off. It wouldn't fly off because I was shaking so much the paramedics couldn't get the reading. So this time they taped my finger to the reader. And I remember very, very clearly as I was shaking on my side with my eyes open and my head was arched backwards because of the dystonia. And so it just happened to be that I could see some of the screen that was showing my heart rate. I remember clearly that the monitor started beeping and flashing red, and it was flashing a lot, and I could see my heart rate was well over 220 beats per minute. I don't know the exact number, but I just remember seeing numbers above 220 beats per minute. And because I was shaking so much and because of the dystonia, I don't know how high my heart rate had gone to, but when I saw the screen, it was over 220 beats per minute. And I remember the staff, they were really shocked. I remember the nurse or support worker, I'm not sure of their role, whoever was stood next to the side of my bed, looking at the screen, I could see the concern on their face and the shock on their face. And I remember they turned to face the doctor, who was behind them, as if to say, what do we do? And the doctor, I remember very, very clearly, said, take it off. And what she was referring to was the pulse reader. She said, take it off. So the nurse or support worker, whoever their role was, took off the pulse reading, even though my pulse was well above 220 beats per minute and I was drenched in sweat from how much I was shaking and for how long this had gone on for. She took off the reading and the doctor came up by my side of my head and my arm was twisted backwards in the air and my hand was twisted backwards like a claw, and she came over to the top of my head and started to stroke my hand that was in the air, twisted backwards, and just bent down next to my ear and simply told me that I should stop doing what I'm doing and that there's no need to keep shaking, and that if I stopped shaking and I stopped having this seizure, then she would give me some apple juice. Genuinely, that is what the A&E doctor told me. She kept repeating that all this girl needs is some apple juice and she'll stop having a seizure. And she kept saying, if you stop having this seizure, I'll give you some apple juice. Come on, you don't have to have this seizure. You can stop doing that now. I'll give you some apple juice if you stop doing that. Genuinely, that is what the doctor in A&E told me as I was having this seizure event with my heart rate well above 220 beats per minute, and at this point it had gone on for well over 1 hour. Obviously, that wasn't going to stop the seizure. Obviously, telling me to have some apple juice wasn't going to stop the episode. I don't even like apple juice. I can't even remember the last time I had apple juice. Essentially, this doctor believed that I was making it up, even though, once again, it is impossible to feign having such a violent episode with lots of saliva coming out of your mouth and your eyes are open and your body is shaking head to toe for well over an hour and your limbs are stuck in odd positions behind you and your muscles are super stiff. There was no way that somebody can feign that, and there was no reason for me to either. I was fit, healthy and well before I got COVID, and I was just waiting to leave hospital because I had nowhere to live. I just got very unlucky with the timing that I got COVID, although I do see it a blessing in disguise at the same time, but I'll talk about that in another video. I was really grateful that the psychiatric hospital that I was at the time where this had occurred sent a really kind staff member with me in the ambulance to accompany me to the hospital. I remember she was relatively new, had only joined the hospital in recent months and had only ever known me ill with symptoms. A lot of the staff at the hospital I was at were new, and so they never met me before I had COVID. They never met me when I was physically and mentally well. They only met me after I started having seizures. She was left in the room with me alone for the next 2 hours, where she gloved up and reassured me and spoke to me and wiped the huge amounts of saliva that was coming out of my mouth non-stop. The hospital staff from A&E simply left her to it. They did nothing to help or support. The only thing that they did was periodically they would come in to inject me with muscle relaxants and then they would leave again. Then they'd come in to check if I was still having a seizure, and I was, so they'd come in and inject me again with another lot of muscle relaxants. And I remember at one point when they did this, whoever it was, must have been the doctor, I don't know. I didn't catch their face or their uniform, but whoever it was that came in to assess my situation, I remember clearly that they said, "My gosh, she's still shaking." They couldn't believe that this was still going on. At this point, it had been several hours that I had been in this episode, and they simply couldn't believe what they were witnessing in front of their eyes. So they injected me again with muscle relaxants, and then they left. And I don't remember much after that. I don't remember much of this episode, other than the brief bits here and there that I've already described. In total, this episode went on for 3 hours. 3 hours, my body was rock solid, like stone. It's the only way I can describe dystonia, is as if my whole body had turned to stone. My arm had been twisted in the air backwards above my head, and my wrist had been turned backwards, and my fingers were stuck like claws. And my whole body was shaking head to toe for over 3 hours. Eventually, the episode ended. I don't remember this at all, but I had written it down in my symptom diary after it happened. What I'd written in my diary is that everything hurt. When I came out of the episode, everything hurt and my speech was slurred. My speech now is still broken and strange because I can feel that I'm going to have a seizure episode, but I'm going to continue filming because this is my reality, and I want to carry on making these videos. Even if no one is watching them, I'm happy to make them because I feel like I have some purpose to what I'm experiencing and what I've gone through. I do remember that I was extremely cold at one point after this episode whilst I was in bed recovering. I don't know how long it had been since the seizure event had ended, but I remember at one point I got very cold, and so I asked for my jumper, and whoever gave me my jumper passed it over to me, and my jumper was drenched in sweat still. It had been several hours. How many hours, I don't know, maybe 6 hours at this point since the seizure had started, and my jumper was still soaking wet, as if it had just come out of the washing machine. That is what I remember. I remember being past my jumper and it was heavy, really heavy, with sweat because of how violently I was shaking. The only other thing I remember is I remember at some point a nurse came and told me that they were going to admit me to the hospital ward for the night. And the next thing I remember after that is that same night being put into a taxi to return back to the psychiatric hospital. And I have no recollection at all of ever speaking to anybody about anything that had happened after this episode. I have no recollection of ever speaking to a doctor. I have no recollection of speaking to a nurse. All I remember is being put into a taxi, and as I was in the taxi, I remember thinking, what happened? I thought I was meant to be admitted to the ward tonight. And that's all I remember. I don't know to this day if anyone actually spoke to me. I have severe memory problems from the muscle relaxants that were given to me, and I was extremely ill from the episode that I'd just come out of. So I don't know if someone spoke to me and I have no recollection of it, or no one actually spoke to me and they didn't explain anything. They simply discharged me back to the psychiatric hospital. I imagine partly because they believed that this was a mental health illness or as a result of a mental health problem. and therefore did not take it seriously. Or I also imagine because I was in the psychiatric hospital, they believed that there was no need to admit me to the physical health hospital because of being in a psychiatric hospital where there were staff there, which I can understand to some extent when there are shortages of beds in general, but it was very difficult to manage at times my physical health whilst being in a psychiatric hospital because of how ill I got. These episodes continued to happen for the next 2 months, and in the period of 2 months it happened on 14 days in total, but on some of those days they were happening multiple times a day. To me it felt like they were happening every day, but that wasn't the case. It was just they were going on for so long that it felt that way, and because of how traumatic it was, it felt like it was happening all day, every day. But actually, according to my symptom diary, it was only happening for 14 days in the space of 2 months. These episodes continued to be very prolonged in that they would go on for several hours, a minimum of 3 hours and a maximum of 6 hours. On one particular day in November, not long after being admitted to the hospital, it went on for 6 hours. On some days, these episodes would happen only once a day, and on other days they would happen up to 4 times a day, each being several hours long. However, the episodes were very strange in their presentation in that I would be shaking for, say, an hour and a half, and then I might come out of it and sit up for all of 10 seconds before I would then fall back to the floor and continue to shake for another 2 hours. Or I might be shaking for 2 hours and then I'd come out of it for 30 seconds and fall to the floor and then continue to shake for another 4 hours. It was excruciatingly painful for me. The seizures themselves were not painful, but the dystonia I was experiencing during the seizures was excruciating. My limbs would be locked, rigid, stiff, as if they turned to stone. That's the only way I can describe it. It felt like everything had turned to stone and that my limbs were going to be dislocated. That's all I kept saying to everybody all of the time. I kept saying it feels like my body's turned to stone and it feels like my elbow's going to be dislocated or my arm is going to be dislocated because of how it would be positioned up in the air, twisted backwards. That was my most common presentation of dystonia during these seizure events. These episodes appear to be happening after I ate anything. I would have breakfast and then not long after having breakfast I would have the seizure events, and then I would come out of it and the staff would tell me to go have a shower and rest and get changed and have some lunch and go relax to try to recover from the intensity of the episode. And so I would go to my room and I would shower and I would get changed and I would have lunch and try to rest the rest of the day. But after having lunch, I would come back to the building and say, I don't feel well again, something's wrong. And then I'd continue to have another seizure-like event immediately after eating lunch. Or sometimes I'd have a snack in the evening or late at night before going to bed. And then on the night shift, I'd have to tell the staff I don't feel well. And then I'd continue to have another seizure event. And this was my life for 2 months at the end of 2022. I was writing in my diary after each episode what had just happened, the presentation, how I felt before and afterwards, and what I was doing before it happened. And every single episode I wrote, I had just eaten breakfast beforehand. Or I would write, I had just eaten lunch beforehand. Or dinner beforehand. Or I had just eaten something beforehand. And that's when very quickly I began to think, maybe food is making me sick, because it appeared to be a pattern of early mornings or late at night when I'd be eating. I don't know why it was only happening for those 14 days in those 2-month period and not the full 2 months, so 60 days. I don't know why, because obviously I was still eating for the remaining of the days. I don't know why it wasn't happening. I was still eating the same foods. I was still eating a plant-based whole food diet every day. And so I don't understand why it wasn't happening every single day. Something else that was very strange about these episodes is that not only was I shaking for very, very long periods of time, several hours, not only was my muscles really stiff and rigid, not only was I having lots of saliva come out of my mouth, not only was I having my limbs contorted in odd positions because of the dystonia, but another strange thing that had happened is during these episodes that would last several hours, the shaking in the seizure-like event would actually stop, but the dystonia was still there and I was still unresponsive and I was just stuck stiff and rigid in odd positions. A bit like catatonia, I guess, but it wasn't quite catatonia. I don't know how to describe it. It was like a mixture of, the entire episode was like a mixture of a seizure, dystonia and catatonia all at once. So I would be having the shaking-like episode, like a seizure, and the muscle stiffness like a seizure, and other symptoms that presented like a seizure would. But the length of time was unusual, and the dystonia was unusual. That would happen during the seizure. But the third thing that was unusual was the fact that I'd just be stuck in odd positions. It's hard to describe. I don't think I have footage of what I mean, but if I do, if I find any footage, I will insert it here now. But essentially, my wrists would be stuck like this, my arm would be stuck in the air like this, and then my legs would be stiff and rigid. And I was aware, I had awareness, my eyes were wide open, but I just couldn't talk, I couldn't communicate, it wasn't in my control. And then after some time being in that position, maybe 20 minutes, maybe 5 minutes, maybe 30 minutes, I don't know how long it would go on for, it would vary each time, but then the shaking and the seizure-like presentation would continue. And this went on for hours, going in and out of these strange episodes of dystonia, catatonia, seizure-like events. It's hard to put a word on how to describe it, but I guess it felt like a mixture of all of those things. For the episode that lasted 6 hours, I think I sat up and came out of the episode maybe on 1 or maximum 2 occasions for around 10 seconds before I fell back down and continued to shake. So although there was around a 20-second break in this 6 hours, I was genuinely shaking for the entirety of 6 hours, minus those 1 or 2 occasions where I briefly came out of it and went straight back into it. It's hard to believe, but it happened to me. I remember parts of the episode, and I had an entire psychiatric hospital of staff witness the episode because they were by my side the entire time it had happened. I think it started around 10 a.m. and by the time it finished it was around 4 p.m. They injected me with muscle relaxants, but because I don't respond well to medication and I have a very delayed reaction to all medication. It took a few hours to kick in. I have a few seconds footage of this episode that I will insert here now. This was taken by a staff member who had my prior consent to film if I had an episode, in order to be able to show the neurologist at the upcoming neurology appointment I had. Not every seizure-like event looked like this. This was just on this day, for this few seconds, it looked like this. But my other episodes, to my memory, were far, far worse. They were far more violent and my limbs were extremely contorted, but I don't have any footage of that. But this is the footage that I do have of that one episode. Usually after these episodes, I was extremely weak and I couldn't really walk or talk or think or barely move. I would also get extremely cold to the bone sort of cold after these episodes. I would go white as a ghost and I would just be shaking from how cold I was. But on this particular occasion and this particular episode, I came out of the episode not only very weak and cold and tired and unable to talk much, but I came out of it extremely confused. I was in an extremely confused state and I didn't really know where I was. I was quite confused and quite distressed, which honestly makes sense given I just spent 6 hours straight shaking and having my limbs very contorted. As I'm filming this now, I can feel dystonia in my neck because my neck is moving to the side. My neck is moving to the side. You might be able to see as I've been filming this, my neck has been moving to the side. This is what can happen to me when I have episodes of being unwell. After these seizure-like events, I'd feel extremely ill. I would feel like I'm going to vomit. I would have a huge headache. I'd feel extremely weak and faint. And it makes sense now looking back on it. But at the time, it was so traumatic and my symptoms were so rapidly changing that I couldn't process anything that was happening to me. I was just in constant survival mode. I really wish I had footage of what these events were looking like, but I don't have any because that wasn't what was on my mind. When I was having these episodes, I wasn't thinking about filming them. I only started to think about filming it because I had a neurology appointment coming up. But at the time, I was in survival mode, and so the last thing I was thinking about was filming. There were times where I wished that someone was filming it as evidence to show the neurologist, but I was unable to communicate to anybody because I was obviously having a seizure event where I was unable to talk or speak. So no one was able to record it for me. I have much more footage of my seizures from January 2024 onwards because I started to deal with my seizures by myself. I knew that I needed to be discharged from hospital and I knew I needed to be in a position where I could cope with them myself. And so I started to deal with the seizures by myself, which meant that I could set up my camera in my room before they happened. And that's why I have more footage of my seizure events and seizure-like activity much later into my long COVID journey. It's been 3.5 years since I got COVID, so I'm used to having seizures and dystonia. It's just part of my daily life. But at the time, I was in crisis, and so I wasn't used to this, and it was new. And I was still learning about my health and my condition. And at the time, I also didn't know that COVID had triggered this. I was lucky in a way that I was in the psychiatric hospital when this was happening to me, because it meant that there were people around night and day, so someone was with me and they could check my saturation and pulse and make sure that it was fine, which it was fine. So they didn't have to call an ambulance. We tried our hardest to not call an ambulance, and we tried our hardest not to go to A&E, because there was nothing that they could do, and the way that they treated me was badly affecting my mental health. It was causing much more harm than good, and so we dealt with the majority of my health in the psychiatric hospital, even though it was not a psychiatric illness. I was waking up every day with some sort of new symptom, whether that be a progression in the seizure-like events, whether that be dystonia, issues with my speech, walking, brain fog, memory loss. I was rapidly deteriorating for the first year that I had COVID. It was difficult to process and comprehend what was happening to me. And even now, almost 4 years later, I don't think I have processed anything that's happened to me, because I've just been in survival mode. And I guess that's why I like making these videos, even for my own self, even if no one watches it, because it's helping me to try to process what I went through. Often after these seizure events, my mouth would pull to the right-hand side, and sometimes it looked like I was having a stroke, but I wasn't having a stroke. It was the dystonia in my face that was making my face pull to the side. Even though I was an informal patient at the psychiatric hospital, meaning I was not legally detained, I didn't really leave the hospital much because of how bad my health was. And I was fearful what's going to happen if this happens to me. I'm in public by myself. It did happen on several occasions where I did have these episodes in public by myself, and people around called an ambulance, so I was taken to A&E. But outside of that, we really tried not to call an ambulance, because after the first few times, when they realised that they can't do anything and they weren't taking it seriously, it was causing me more harm. Anyway, I'm going to end the video here now, because it's probably quite a long video, and I'm likely going to have a seizure and or dystonic episode now, given my neck is pulled to the side. My speech has got a little bit better, but I don't feel very well. So I'm going to end the video now. I can feel the dystonia in my neck is pulling me sideways. Enjoyed watching this video, and that maybe you learnt something new. And if you are experiencing any sort of dystonia and or seizures, then you're not alone, and I know what it's like. And I'll be interested to know if anyone else has experienced dystonia whilst they've been having a seizure. COVID hasn't gone away, and it's taken so much from people's lives and people's health. And that's why I talk about what I've gone through, because I know what it's like to have people disbelieve you, and I know what it's like to feel really alone after getting sick from COVID. But anything you're experiencing after your COVID infection or anything else in the past few years, then I believe you. Anyway, I'm going to go now. I will see you in another video. I'll see you in another video. Bye.